From what we understand right now, it was about 207,000 feet above the Earth, traveling at about 12,500 miles per hour. It was over north central Texas. NASA has declared an emergency and contingency plans, and they're urging anybody in that area to be careful if any debris comes on the ground. If they see anything there, it possibly could be radioactive. They're warning people to stay clear of that area. This is the longest time that communication has been lost with a shuttle flight. And of course, at this time, we're still hoping for the best. Looking at the video here that you see, there are several trails coming from this aircraft. And of course, one of our experts here, Dexter Ingram, who is a former Navy pilot, says, of course, this does not look good.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, if it broke up at 200,000 feet above the above Texas here, let's listen to what the update is.
The space shuttle has been declared in mission control. Flight controllers here are securing all information, data, and notes pertinent to the descent of the Space Shuttle Columbia this morning from orbit. The last communications were received from the Space Shuttle Columbia at approximately 8 a.m. Central Time, as it was an altitude of about 200,000 feet above north central Texas, en route to a planned landing at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida at 8:16 a.m. Central Time. Search and rescue teams in the Dallas-Fort Worth area have been alerted to the Space Shuttle contingency. Any debris that may be located in the Dallas-Fort Worth vicinity should be avoided and may be hazardous due to the toxic nature of propellants used on board the shuttle, and should be reported to local law enforcement authorities. To repeat, any debris that is located in the Dallas-Fort Worth area should be avoided, as it may be hazardous due to toxic substances used as propellant on board the space shuttle, and should be reported to local law enforcement authorities. This is Mission Control, Houston.
Any moment we expect to be joined by Buzz Aldrin, former astronaut, who will be able to perhaps tell us more about what's going on today. We just heard from NASA updating us. You know, they're not saying that they've lost the Space Shuttle Columbia. They are saying that they are in a contingency mode right now and that they consider this an emergency situation. But obviously, if you've been watching us for the past few minutes, you see the pictures and you see that it looks truly horrifying there. Buzz Aldrin is with us now. Mr. Aldrin, thank you for joining us. What can you tell us from what you've been hearing for the past, 45 minutes now?
Well, I'm afraid I can't tell you very much other than that I got up at 6 o'clock to watch the orbiter reentry. And as soon as I turned in some of the cable networks that were covering the entry, there didn't seem to be much going on. There wasn't much communication.
Are you looking at your television now?
Yes, I am.
And you see the pieces of debris. It looks as if it's pieces of debris over north central Texas.
Yeah, that's very similar to the debris that emanated after the Challenger accident. And of course, for those who were watching the entry, I wasn't fortunate enough or unfortunate enough to have a ticket paid to go out to the South Pacific to see the Mir enter, but those people kind of missed what was happening. But the view is very, very similar, as the main portion of the center of gravity of the shuttle proceeds in its entry path. When other pieces are separated from it for whatever reason, they're all going to follow the same path also, so they're going to be slightly separated, but they'll show traces of entry paths that are, of course, going all in the same direction, and everything is going to re-enter once the deorbit burn is made. Every piece of that, every particle that comprises the shuttle is going to enter the atmosphere. And whether it burns up or not, it'll hit the ground.
Mr. Aldrin, what can you tell us about the safety features of this aircraft? Is there anything, or would there be anything on board in case something like this were to happen, that these astronauts could be jettisoned to safety?
Well, I have a company called Starcraft Boosters, and we have been doing some studies recently for an ejection pod that could be incorporated into the present shuttle fleet. That's quite an expensive and major overhaul, Alternatives to that are ejection seats for the crew, and when the shuttle was first flown, the first flight up Columbia, John Young and Bob Crippen had ejection seats, and those were flown in several of the subsequent shuttle flights for the crew safety to be able to separate the crew from the orbiter. It has been absolutely useless under these conditions. The only thing that could save the crew would be a separable pod that could maintain control, and it just so happens that the last few weeks I've been pursuing verbally suggestions that we should look at the alternative of designing a Shuttle 2, a second-generation Shuttle 2, that would have an ejection pod on it that could save the crew, and that could happen at any time during launch. The ejectable pod could save the crew at any time during launch and throughout the flight. We would design that pod so that it could also be adapted as the crew return or crew rescue vehicle on the space station. It's a plan that I have had in my own mind and discussing with other people as an alternative to be looked at. And I'm sure after the events of today begin to settle down and we understand exactly what happened, there will be an increased movement toward establishing a crew ejectable pod on the space shuttles. Whether they will ever do that for the present orbiters is debatable.
Yeah, our more immediate concern, of course,
now.
Our immediate concern now is what's happening today. We're talking with the second man to walk on the moon, Buzz Aldrin, who has awakened this morning, as you probably have.
Prior to that, and I think it was probably, well, you can see here quite clearly there's some pieces there. I think this might be after what oh, there it is, right there. See that smoke? See that there was a flash and then a puff of smoke. That was clearly some kind of explosion. Probably a secondary explosion, because what you saw first were those initial pieces that came off for a brief period of time, maybe 2-3 seconds, then a burst, then the smoke that went behind it, and then shortly thereafter, as you see, multiple pieces being tracked there very clearly in this shot. And as I say, it reminds me so much of seeing the Space Shuttle Mir as it came down to Earth, coming down in multiple pieces, streaking down that way. Very, even to a layperson, this is quite clearly a breakup of the vehicle. Norm Thagard, your thoughts? Is Norm there? Okay. Who do we have?
Jerry.
I'm sorry?
Jerry Linenger.
Jerry. Are you able to see CNN yet?
Yes, I am. Yeah. I've been watching.
All right.
I think you're exactly right in what you're analyzing. I would say it's mostly secondary things, the puff of smoke and that. You've got a lot of materials. You're coming through a lot of friction, a lot of heat, and if things are not protected by the tiles, they're going to heat up, and any chemicals on board or leftover rocket fuel, anything of that nature is going to ignite.
Okay, I wasn't able to hear a lot of what you said there. They were talking to me, Jerry. I hope you understand. But
no problem.
There's that flash. You want to offer any sort of supposition there?
Yeah, I would say just what you said. It's very dynamic, and when you're coming in, you're heating everything.
I'm Tracy Hutchins with CNN Headline News. We've been airing, actually, CNN for continuing coverage of this breaking news story. Right now, NASA has declared an emergency. They have lost contact with the Space Shuttle Columbia. They have been out of contact with that space shuttle for about an hour now. And again, we will continue this breaking news story, and we will hand it back over to CNN. But for now, you are watching Headline News.
But let's recap once again, if we could. The Space Shuttle Columbia was supposed to land at the Kennedy Space Center 9:16 a.m. Eastern Time, 45 minutes ago. That has not happened. What has happened is what you see here, right around the 9 o'clock Eastern hour, as it was.
Leave a picture of some of them during the shuttle mission, making one of the routine broadcasts that we have become so accustomed to. And as John Nance has told us, it has become almost routine for us over the years since 1986. That's 15 years ago when we had the Space Shuttle disaster on liftoff. Since that time, we have become accustomed to routine landings, to news conferences from outer space, such as this one from the Space Shuttle Columbia recently. Again, the Space Shuttle Columbia missing, disturbing pictures of some kind of craft, apparently the Space Shuttle Columbia breaking up upon reentry over northern Texas. NASA has issued warnings to people to stay away from any debris from the shuttle they may see landing, but to note where it is. And an indication that NASA is very concerned. They've sent out rescue missions as well. We have here a model of the space shuttle that we're looking at, trying to figure out exactly where the insulation came from that we are told broke off from the fuel tank upon takeoff, and according to the reports we're seeing, hit the left wing. But the analysis that we understand took place in Mission Control at that time figured that it had not caused any serious problems. However, there is clearly something that went wrong. Here is the video from this morning, somewhere around 9 o'clock, multiple contrails, eventually as this object coming into the atmosphere apparently begins to break up. It was at a height, we're told, of about 200,000 feet over Texas when NASA and Mission Control lost contact with the Space Shuttle Columbia. You can see there what appear to be more than one sources of contrail, and what appears to be, according to several people, including John Nance, the ABC aviation consultant, what appears to be the breaking up of Space Shuttle Columbia this morning in its attempted landing as it came in over Texas. 7 astronauts on board, 6 Americans and 1 Israeli. The trouble apparently began somewhere before it reached down to 200,000 feet, 40 miles in the air, still virtually in outer space, but within range of these cameras. NASA is sending rescue missions into the area. We understand that residents of North Texas heard a big bang at about the time the Space Shuttle Columbia disappeared on its way to a landing at Cape Canaveral. One man said it was like a car hitting the house or an explosion that shook that much. It's not clear what that might have been. That could have been simply a sonic boom, for example. It's way too soon to conclude in any way what has happened exactly. Columbia is NASA's oldest shuttle, and it first flew in 1981, so more than 20 years, 22 years. We now have a former astronaut, Norm Thagard, with us. Former shuttle astronaut Norm Thagard. Mr. Thagard, good morning. What can you tell us of what you've seen so far?
Looking at the pictures, unless it's extraordinary circumstance, it appears that the shuttle is broken up on entry.
You've gone through this before many times. What kind of procedures are there inside a shuttle cabin when you begin to have troubles? You've gone through many simulations as well as the real thing. What would the astronauts have been doing when they saw this happening?
You have checklist, both a routine checklist and you have emergency checklist. So you look at what the symptoms are, and based on the things that you see on your meters and your dials and other information, you go to the appropriate procedure and begin to go through those procedures.
What kind of recourse do you have if you realize that something catastrophic has happened to the shuttle around you, and if the cabin is still basically intact? Are you in your pressure suits? Do you have parachutes available? What do you begin to do?
Since the Challenger accident, we have had pressure suits with a parachute, and if it were the case that the crew cabin stayed intact and the G-forces weren't so enormous that that caused harm, then you might have some chance of getting out.
What do you think the odds of survival are from what you've seen on television this morning?
Well, you almost hate to say anything about it since family members probably watch, but you would have to think they're not great.
We understand that NASA has sent out search and rescue parties already. What would they be looking for? Any signs of parachute descent? Is there any way they can pick that up on special instruments?
That might be picked up on radar. There are no special instruments. However, each crew member has a radio which has an emergency beacon, and those are the standard emergency beacons that boats have and parachutists have, aircraft have, and they do allow rescuers to find your location.
A question which everybody will inevitably be asking, and we have to ask it, of course, indicating it's only because of the general times we live in, but whenever we see any kind of catastrophe these days, we wonder if terrorism could conceivably be involved. But from what we understand from NASA, this was at least 40 miles high when the trouble happened. Can you imagine that there could be any possible connection to terrorism at such a height?
I would think that would be extraordinarily unlikely. The only country with any sort of capability to do intercepts on a vehicle moving that fast is the United States, and even at that, it's still in an experimental and test phase for us, so it's doubtful that this is a terrorist act.
How disturbed would you be if you were flying in it about the idea that a piece of insulation had broken off, as we understand it did, from the fuel tank and hit the wing of the shuttle on takeoff?
I couldn't hear that question. You're coming in very faintly on my phone here.
Yes, Mr. Thagard, we're speaking with former shuttle astronaut Norman Thagard. Mr. Thagard, we understand in reports we're seeing today that a piece of insulation did break off of the fuel tank when the Columbia was taking off on January 16th and is believed to have hit the wing of the shuttle. Would that be of concern to you if you were flying in the shuttle, and what problem would it cause?
Well, that material on the fuel tank is pretty soft material. However, if it did cause damage, or if anything caused damage to the leading edge of the wing, it would be a bad situation. And of course, it would depend on the amount of damage, but it potentially could be a bad situation.
Right. We understand that in 42 years of U.S. space flight, there has never been an accident during the descent to Earth on landing, though there have been other accidents, of course. We also now understand that President Bush was informed about the Space Shuttle Columbia and is awaiting more information. Also, officials say there's no information that terrorism is involved, and as former shuttle astronaut Norman Thagard has just told us, he thinks it's extremely unlikely there could be any terrorism involved, given that it was at least 40 miles high when the trouble began. That's Mr. Thagard, 40 miles high. Give us a feeling for how much still in outer space that is. There's virtually no atmosphere there, is that right?
There's very little atmosphere. Sort of arbitrarily, we assign 50 miles as the beginning of space, and in fact, if you're going to get your astronaut wings, that is the altitude we use. Anyone flying above that altitude is awarded astronaut wings.
Right, and if you could just talk us very quickly again through what the normal procedure for you all is, looking out for possible trouble when you come in on what up until now have been the routine landings coming in from orbit. What do you experience inside the shuttle as you're coming down, and at what altitude do you begin to experience it in terms of heat and the buildup of the flames around the shuttle?
Well, of course, different astronauts have said different things. I came back 5 times on the space shuttle, and I was always impressed of how smooth and uneventful it was. Of course, you have a 3-person crew for the entry. There may be other people on board, but it is the commander, the pilot, and the flight engineer that concern themselves with the vehicle's performance during entry, and you basically just follow your checklist, and normally it's very routine, and you go down through the procedure step by step with little consequence.
And as the heat builds up around the shuttle, are you able to tell that there are flames around it and that the shuttle is protecting you from the forces of the buildup of the friction?
I have not seen the plasma. Of course, I've seen the pink salmon glow of the plasma, and you always see that. There are others who, in looking up over the up top through the overhead windows, who have described seeing the licking flames of the plasma. So certainly you do have this ionized air. You're moving so fast, you're literally stripping electrons off the few atoms of or molecules of air that are there.
So clearly there are major forces in play here, and it's, I suppose, conceivable that if a breakup happens, it could all happen very quickly. We don't know yet, of course, what has happened exactly, but it does not look good. Thank you, Mr. Thagard. We'd like to ask you to stand by. We'll certainly have more questions. For those of you just joining us, the Space Shuttle Columbia is missing. NASA at about 9 o'clock this morning issued an announcement of an emergency after they lost contact with the Columbia when it was attempting to land over the state of Texas. We have video from Dallas station WFAA that shows what appears to be the shuttle passing overhead, and then multiple trails indicating that the craft may have broken up as it moved across the sky. NASA has scrambled search and rescue teams to try to see if there's any chance, any sign of any survivors from the crew. We understand there were 6 Americans and 1 Israeli on board, the first Israeli astronaut. In fact, this is the video that we have from Dallas station WFAA showing what we think is the shuttle re-entering this morning, attempting to re-enter. 6 Americans, Israel's first astronaut, also went into orbit aboard the Shuttle Columbia on January 16th, the first serious emergency and apparent disaster. It appears to be what is the case, given what NASA is issuing this morning, that there has been with the shuttle project since 1986, when the Challenger exploded upon takeoff. This is the first time in more than 40 years of U.S. spaceflight that there has been any kind of serious problem on re-entry. This is the first time there's been a serious problem with re-entry in the manned space program. The crew includes Commander Rick Husband, pilot William McCool, the payload commander Michael Anderson, Kaplana Chawla, David Brown, Laurel Clark, and Ilan Roman, a colonel in the Israeli Air Force, and he is the first Israeli astronaut, the first Israeli in outer space. There's a picture of the STS-107 crew who are now missing over Texas, and the announcements coming in from NASA are not good. They're warning people to stay away from any debris from the shuttle that they may find in the area around northern Texas. Mr. Thagard, former shuttle astronaut Norm Thagard, is with us. Tell us, if you would, what sort of forces could cause this kind of breakup as the shuttle tries to land?
The most likely cause is the air itself. You're moving so fast that the aerodynamic pressure is extraordinary, and if you're not in the correct attitude, the forces on the vehicle can cause it to break up very easily.
So, in other words, if it needs to be at the correct attitude, I suppose there must be a number of very complicated technological maneuvers and pieces of instrumentation involved in trying to get it just at the right angle to make sure that the wrong parts of the shuttle don't get heated up. Is that right?
That's correct. You have heating effects due to the very high speed at which you hit the atmosphere. The various areas of the shuttle are designed to take the heat that they're likely to experience. If it's not in the correct attitude, then of course you're going to get both aerodynamic forces and heating forces where there may be no protection.
Are those maneuvers something that are partly taken over by computer, or is it all done by hand by the pilot of the shuttle?
Normally the shuttle is completely under computer control, with the commander not taking over manual control until about the time you're overhead the field and just going subsonic. Right.
What kind of emergency procedures are you taught, and do you have in mind for this kind of breakup? What's the first kind of procedure that would come to your mind if you were in the shuttle, as you have been before, coming in on landing, when you perceived that it was breaking up? What would you do?
If you perceive the shuttle's breaking up, I think there is no emergency procedure that covers that. The emergency procedures cover failures in systems, which can, of course, lead to a breakup. So you can treat the symptoms, but you may not be able to do anything about the cause.
And if, by some great stroke of luck, and assuming that this is the shuttle breaking up in the atmosphere, which we indicate, we understand from NASA it is, what would be the first signs that NASA would be looking for that any of the astronauts might have survived? Would there be any kind of radio transmission coming automatically, even if they'd lost consciousness, if they were descending from parachutes?
There is an emergency radio that each astronaut has, and in the event of a bailout, those radios activate. They do send out a locator signal, and if they did survive and got out, I would assume that those locator signals are going off even now.
We understand also that Columbia is the oldest of the shuttles flying. It was launched in 1981, 22 years in service. Has there been concern among the astronauts that it was getting to be time to retire any of these shuttles?
I would doubt that. Each shuttle was designed to have a flight lifetime of 100 flights, and I don't think even Columbia, as the oldest, is even approaching anything close to that.
Right. Again, for those of you just joining us, NASA has declared an emergency. The shuttle Columbia is missing over Texas. They lost contact with it when it was at about 200,000 feet, more than 40 miles up in the atmosphere, just beginning to come into the atmosphere. This is video that we have here of what appears to be the shuttle breaking up as it re-entered the atmosphere over northern Texas. Search and rescue teams are out. Warnings to people in the region to note the landing of any debris from the shuttle, but to stay away from it, and to inform authorities immediately. 7 people on board. The crew includes Commander Rick Husband, pilot William McCool, the payload commander Michael Anderson, also Kalpana Chawla, David Brown, Laurel Clark, and Ilan Roman, a colonel in the Israeli Air Force, the first Israeli astronaut. There were, of course, concerns about possible terrorism at the takeoff and at the landing site. But there's no indication that anything like that is involved here. And as Norm Thagard is telling us, a former shuttle astronaut we are talking to here, he says he thinks it's extremely unlikely there could be anything like terrorism at such a great height, virtually up in outer space. We will now go to the White House, where Pamela Edwards is standing by. Pamela, what can you tell us about Tamala Edwards? Sorry, Tamala. What can you tell us about the White House this morning? What are they hearing?
Well, Bill, this is a White House in the process of collecting information. They themselves are still trying to get a handle on this. The president woke up at Camp David and has convened a conference call there. As well, the head of NASA has briefed Andy Card, the chief of staff, who is a conduit to the president. He should be back here around noon. They'll continue to be in consultations, but at this moment they are very busy themselves trying to get a handle on what is going on here and how they intend to respond.
Do you know what time it was when the president was informed?
Well, the news started to come out around 9. I'm not exactly sure of the time that the president found out, but it seems as though all the calls started to go out around then, and that there's cell phone calls flying, everyone trying to pick up on more information, still gathering these details, but not quite sure yet what they want their response to be at this moment.
Of course, Tamala, we have no official word from NASA of what has happened other than that the Space Shuttle Columbia is missing, that they've sent out search and rescue missions, and that they're warning people to stay away from any debris that landed. But no official word that it has necessarily broken up, although that's certainly what experts looking at the pictures seem to indicate. But I take it from what you're saying there that the mood at the White House is also
very serious.
Very serious, and that something catastrophic seems to have happened. Have you heard anybody in the White House refer to it as a done fact that the space shuttle has broken up?
Not in those terms, but if you look at all the indicators, the president rushing back here, a number of senior staffers rushing here, that they know this is very serious, they're very concerned, and are sort of trying to gather as much information as they can and determine exactly what sort of face they want to put forward to the public, as well as privately what they'll have to say about this afternoon.
Right. Tamala Edwards at the White House standing by. Thank you very much. Again, for those of you just joining us, NASA has lost contact with the Space Shuttle Columbia. The White House, we now know, is on high alert, trying to gather information and decide how to respond. NASA does not know exactly what happened and is not saying what happened, but they are sending people to search for the astronauts somewhere in the area of northern Texas. The video that we've seen, that our aviation experts and former shuttle astronauts have seen and have told us, looks very much like they would expect it to look if what we had here was a shuttle breaking up on re-entry into the atmosphere. We now have producer David Herndon in Dallas, ABC producer David Herndon in Dallas, who apparently heard the explosion or some kind of explosion. David, what can you tell us?
Bill, I was inside my house, which is just north of DFW Airport on the north side of Dallas. My wife and I heard a loud boom. It shook the house. The windows rattled. We stepped out into the backyard and sort of looked up in the sky, and some of the neighbors were doing the same thing, looking out their windows, stepping out in the front lawn to see what it was. And we didn't see anything, and it sort of sounded like a sonic boom, and that's what we assumed it was, and we sort of all shrugged our shoulders and walked back inside. It was only moments later that we found out that the shuttle was missing.
David, that kind of sonic boom is quite frequent in some places. Did this sonic boom, or whatever this boom was, strike you as being in any way different from what a normal sonic boom would be? Was there something unusual that brought you outside?
It was very unusual because we wouldn't normally hear. I've never heard a sonic boom in that area, and certainly not an explosion that loud.
Right. Former shuttle astronaut Norm Thagard, what does it tell you that people are reporting this apparent sonic boom and coming outside something slightly different from it?
Well, it tells me that this is not the normal shuttle entry. You do get a sonic boom, of course, but over Dallas it should not be all that remarkable. So it means that basically whatever caused that boom was not very aerodynamic, and it produced a huge pressure wave.
I see. So it's not as clean a boom as you would normally expect to have.
No, the normal boom, if you were in Dallas, I would expect to hear perhaps a real sharp double boom, but it would be over in a split second. You wouldn't hear anything else.
Right. As we know, the crew included Rick Husband, pilot William McCool, the payload commander Michael Anderson, Kalpana Chawla, David Brown, Laurel Clark, and Ilan Ramon, a colonel in the Israeli Air Force, the first Israeli astronaut. Mr. Thagard, did you by chance know any of these people?
No, it's remarkable. I retired in 1996, but I didn't know any of the seven.
The space flights have become so routine almost that we can well imagine that it's different in terms of the general community of those of you who have gone up in the shuttle. There must be hundreds of you now. Are you in any way a close club, or are you pretty much spread across the engineering community and the pilot community?
I think you're always close so long as you remain in the office. Once you leave, unless you remain in the Houston area, of course, we're geographically widely dispersed. We do have annual reunions, and some try to get back for those, and so it's probably not like an ordinary job. We do stay somewhat close, but obviously it's going to vary person to person.
Right, and I can imagine all former shuttle astronauts right now feeling especially close as the thoughts and concerns of everyone in NASA, their family, and the entire country and people around the world are waiting for word for what NASA may find as they send out these search and rescue missions in the area. The Space Shuttle Columbia missing over northern Texas broke up apparently in the atmosphere as it was entering, if the pictures that we're seeing are any indication. And there's a picture of it now. Again, as you can see, more than one contrail of what are apparently several pieces of the Space Shuttle Columbia coming in. And we should emphasize that there is no indication of terrorism. There was some concern about that because the first Israeli astronaut was on board. But this trouble seems to have begun before the Space Shuttle Columbia was even down to the altitude of 40 miles, virtually no atmosphere up there. A very tricky maneuver for the shuttle at all times as it tries to make its way through the enormous forces and heat at great speed, hitting the molecules of air as it comes into the atmosphere. The tiles on the space shuttle supposed to disperse the heat, but as various experts are telling us this morning, any number of things could go wrong that might lead to a breakup. I'd like to ask again Norm Thagard, the former shuttle astronaut who is on the line with us. Mr. Thagard, we're looking at this potentially heartbreaking picture here of this fiery descent. Describe for us how complex it is keeping the space shuttle just exactly poised as it needs to be to avoid this kind of thing. Are there any number of things that could have gone wrong if that's what has in fact happened?
There are certainly more than one thing that can go wrong. You have rockets that must fire. You have hydraulic generators that basically activate the normal aircraft controls like rudders, ailerons, and that sort of thing, and you have your computers, so there can be problems in several systems that can produce a problem like this.
If we are indeed looking at the breakup of the shuttle here, what kind of evidence will there be that NASA can have? Will there have been a routine broadcasting of technical data from the shuttle back down to the ground so that in the moments leading up to it they will have evidence to look at?
Absolutely. It used to be in the early days before the satellite communication that there was a blackout period on entry, but that's not the case anymore, so I would suspect that they had voice and data up until the very last moment.
Right. Is there anything like a black box in the space shuttle? We know from airline crashes that that's one of the first things that investigators look for. Is there something like that on board shuttle that will have possibly remained intact, recording information?
Well, of course, the whole shuttle is essentially a black box. It's all under the control of 5 computers, and every last computer command is recorded somewhere.
Any kind of black box on board, though, that is especially designated to be recording information and survive a catastrophe such as this?
I don't remember a black box. Perhaps there's somebody else that has more specific information about that. But again, you almost don't need a black box because every last transaction through the computer system is broadcast to the ground.
Right. And with those enormous forces, of course, there's every possibility that there wouldn't have been much of a chance for the astronauts to respond in a way to protect themselves, but it's not impossible. I take it that you've been telling us in any case that this is not anything we should make any conclusions about early on, that these pictures that we're looking at here don't necessarily mean that there are not survivors. Is that right?
Well, you can't absolutely rule it out. I would say it's probably unlikely, but in the case of the Challenger accident, for instance, the crew cabin did remain intact despite the explosion, and there's some thought that had they had parachutes and pressure suits, we would have had survivors from the Challenger accident.
Right. We've just learned that President Bush was at Camp David in Maryland when he was informed about the situation that came up shortly after 9 o'clock this morning when NASA lost contact and these pictures first emerged. And a senior U.S. official speaking on condition of anonymity said that there has been no threat made against the flight and that the shuttle was at an altitude of such great height, more than 200,000 feet, more than 40 miles over north central Texas when it lost contact, that it was out of range of any surface-to-air missiles. We do not, therefore, from everything we're hearing from all of the experts and officials we're talking to, seem to be looking at anything connected with terrorism, but rather at apparently some terrible catastrophe, some problem with reentry. The first time in 42 years of U.S. manned flight that there has been a problem and what appears to be an unsafe and potentially fatal accident on reentry. The Challenger accident in 1986 occurred on takeoff. There were, of course, some very sad deaths on the ground as spacecraft were being tested before that. But this, if we are indeed looking at the breakup of the Space Shuttle Columbia this Saturday morning, is the first time there has been an accident in the U.S. manned space program on reentry. For those of you just joining us, NASA has declared an emergency. It appears that the Space Shuttle Columbia broke up on reentry this morning, coming in over northern Texas at an altitude of more than 40 miles. Very high, virtually above all of the atmosphere. No indication, according to officials, senior U.S. officials, of anything connected with terrorism and out of the range of any kind of surface-to-air missiles. This does appear to be some kind of a failure in the reentry process which caused the Columbia to break up. NASA has warned people to stay away from any debris that may have scattered around. They are sending out search and rescue missions. We have the names of the crew. We do not know that all of the family have been notified of this serious problem. But the crew includes the commander, Rick Husband, the pilot, William McCool, payload commander, Michael Anderson, Kalpana Chawla, David Brown, Laurel Clark, and Ilan Ramon, a colonel in the Israeli Air Force who was the first Israeli astronaut. a 16-day mission, I believe it was. There you can see one of the routine news conferences that we have become so accustomed to from the space shuttle. It has become such a regular part of life. 15 years since the 15 years and more, 17 years, I believe, since the Space Shuttle Columbia Space Shuttle Discovery accident on liftoff in 1986. This is now live coverage from the mission control, where they are trying to figure out what happened and keeping track of the various rescue missions that have gone out into the area looking for any sign of what happened, and of course the primary concern, seeing if there's any sign of survivors, that any of the 7 astronauts managed to make it out and down to the ground safely. For those of you just joining us, NASA has declared an emergency. This morning, just after 9 o'clock, NASA and Mission Control lost contact with the Space Shuttle Columbia after 16 days of flight was making its way back to its landing strip over northern Texas at a height of more than 40 miles. They lost contact, and the pictures immediately showed what appeared to be the Space Shuttle Columbia breaking up. People around the area down in Texas report a very loud boom, something a little bit unusual in its sound. They hear sonic booms from time to time, but this brought a number of people outside to look up in the air wondering what it was. Former shuttle astronaut Norm Thagard tells us that could be an indication of something that is not as normally smooth and orderly, producing a very different kind of sound than people had become accustomed to in these routine flights. Norm Thagard, shuttle astronaut, tell us, had it become routine for you all as well? We, the public, have become so accustomed to seeing shuttles come and go all the time, almost like clockwork. Had it become routine for all of you who are in the astronaut corps?
It, like with anyone else, it tends to become a bit routine. However, the ascent, certainly when you're riding that big rocket, is not routine in anyone's mind. I personally always thought that the overwhelming portion of the risk of a flight was the 8.5 minutes that you were on the rocket's own ascent, with entry being a fairly safe and uneventful thing. But clearly the shuttle has to be in exactly the correct attitude, or you can have serious problems.
If it's tilted slightly to the left or right, for example, then too much of the air brushes against it at those great speeds and heats it up and puts pressure. Is that correct?
As you get lower and lower in the atmosphere, you're moving so fast that the aerodynamic forces on the vehicle quickly rise, and you can wind up with forces that can generate heat and also mechanical pressure on the vehicle to cause it to break up.
Right. David Herndon, an ABC producer who lives in Texas, heard this sonic boom this morning. Let's listen to his description of what he heard and how it impressed him.
My house, which is just north of DFW Airport on the north side of Dallas, my wife and I heard a loud boom. It shook the house. The windows rattled. We stepped out into the backyard and sort of looked up in the sky, and some of the neighbors were doing the same thing, looking out their windows, stepping out in the front lawn to see what it was. And we didn't see anything, and it sort of sounded like a sonic boom, and that's what we assumed it was, and we sort of all shrugged our shoulders and walked back inside. It was only moments later that we found out that the shuttle was missing.
David, that kind of sonic boom is quite frequent in some places. Did this sonic boom, or whatever this boom was, strike you as being in any way different from what a normal sonic boom would be? Was there something unusual that brought you outside?
It was very unusual because we wouldn't normally hear. I've never heard a sonic boom in that area, and certainly not an explosion that loud. Right.
Former shuttle astronaut Norm Thagard appearing to have broken up over northern Texas. Tamala Edwards is at the White House, where she has been monitoring their activity there this morning. Tamala, what can you tell us about the president and his advisors in what they're learning and what their response is going to be?
Well, that they're hurrying back here to the White House. A number of staffers coming in, preparing probably for a press conference, also for the president to motorcade back from Camp David. They also are monitoring all this information and trying to be more definitive about what it is they're hearing. It seems as though they're just as concerned and just as somewhat confused as the rest of us happen to be. They also have to be careful. The president, when he finally does come out and say something, as in all situations that look like they might be a tragedy, he needs to offer a face of consoling to the public, but also he needs to be as accurate as he can be. So they're trying to reserve saying any statement until he gets back here and gets a hold of more facts.
Right. How specifically are any of the people you're talking to there describing what has happened? Have they specifically used the words yet that indicate that there's no question that the Shuttle Columbia is lost?
Well, to be honest, Bill, more than anything, they're sort of presenting a face really of being flustered, of still trying to get a hold of this and trying to get a hold of the information, still making a number of calls themselves and presenting more of a face of they still just don't know exactly what has happened.
The president, I understand, was at Camp David when he learned he's on his way back. Is that right?
Right. Exactly. The weather, as you can see here, is not great. He won't be choppering back. He'll be motorcading back. We're hearing around noon that might get pushed back a little bit.
Right. Tamala Edwards at the White House, thank you. Standing by. We'll come back to you shortly. Mr. Oberg, Jim Oberg, a former shuttle engineer, we're beginning to get some pictures in of what seems to have happened, more and more appearing certain that the Space Shuttle Columbia did break up upon re-entry. As an engineer, what do you immediately think might be in play here?
Well, as an engineer and as a former mission controller myself, what's in play is going through all the possible procedures, all the possible things that still could have the crew make it through, perhaps free-falling in the cabin and then bailing out, and needing rescue, which is why people are now looking. The odds of that are unpredictable and probably not very high, but you'd have to be doing those kind of things right now because there is always there remains that chance. But this vehicle coming in over Texas, and we've watched them from Texas here frequently when they come in, leaving a fireball behind, 40 miles high, traveling around Mach 12. It's a spectacular sight. This morning, unfortunately, the site became one of fireworks and debris that would be crushed by what's called the deceleration forces. The normal vehicle is doing about 3 Gs, or sorry, about 1.5 Gs during entry. It's a very soft re-entry, 1.5 Gs as it glides through the air. If it breaks apart, it becomes a ballistic braking and goes up to 6 to 8 G forces, which, if someone's in a cabin, could be real serious. So you think about all those forces. You think about all the energy that's being released by this impact in the atmosphere, and you watch this thing come apart. We've done it more than 100 times. There's got to be something different about this entry that we still don't know.
Mr. Oberg, after the Challenger accident in 1986, we saw a long and probing investigation. NASA suspended the shuttle program for a couple of years. We heard testimony in front of Congress and a number of other panels about what went wrong. Do you think that we're probably in for that here?
No, I think we're in a fundamentally different situation here, because back in the Challenger there was a discovery of an engineering flaw, a design flaw that was not properly treated. Now we seem to have more likely some kind of operational or decision flaw or some random mistake. We know this works. We've done 100 re-entries successfully with the shuttle, and we know there aren't design flaws in the re-entry. Was there damage during a launch? We've seen some very intriguing video of something hitting the left wing during ascent. Could it have been something damaging that came off the fuel tank and damaged some of the leading high-temperature tiles? There'll be some investigation of that. There was some thought during the flight, and it was felt that there was not severe damage. But clearly, something on the shuttle wasn't working the way we know it does work. It does work, has worked in the past, and it will work again. We have a crew on the International Space Station right now that depends on a shuttle flight in a matter of a month or two to be replaced. So we got some very serious issues here beyond this flight. We have the entire International Space Station program depends on the shuttle flying again and safely soon.
Right. So though we're clearly in for investigations, the fact that the space station is up there means that there isn't the luxury of just stopping everything for 2 or 3 years, because the space station itself has people on board and needs to be serviced. Mr. Thagard, former shuttle astronaut, now what do you make of what we're facing here?
Well, I would agree with what Jim said. There was a definite engineering problem with the Space Shuttle solid rocket boosters. There's no known problem with the entry process, and we do have folks up on the International Space Station. It is possible to get those folks back using Russian Soyuz vehicles, but for the continued viability of the station, we've got to have access by the shuttle to the station.
Right. Thank you, Norm Thager, former shuttle astronaut. George Stephanopoulos is standing by now. I believe he's in Washington. George, I understand you've talked now to the Israeli ambassador because, of course, of the 7 people on board here, 6 were Americans, and there was Ilan Ramon, the first Israeli astronaut.
That's right, Bill. I did speak with the Israeli ambassador, Danny Ayalon, a little earlier this morning. His first indications, and these were just preliminary indications, back up what we've heard already, that there's no sign at all that this was a terrorist attack, but he was actually awaiting a fully briefing from Sean O'Keefe, the head of NASA.
Right. Is there any indication of what the response in Israel is to all of this?
Again, just beginning. He was working the phones just like all of us. In fact, he found out the same way so many people did this morning, was watching television and saw the trails go across the sky. So he immediately started to get in contact with his government, trying to find out what he could from the government here. But there's been no immediate reaction from Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's office yet.
Thank you, George. George Stephanopoulos in Washington. Terry Moran is now standing by at the White House. Terry, what have you learned about the president's response, when he learned it, and what his plans are?
Well, this morning, as you know, the president was informed by his chief of staff, Andy Card, who's up at Camp David with him, about the situation. I was just speaking with a senior administration official who said, however, that right now the White House is just still in information gathering mode and that NASA will go first. That was his explanation of how the information will come from the government. It is expected that NASA will try to explain as best it can, as it gathers this information, what happened, and then subsequently, sometime this afternoon probably, we should hear from the president. He's got a different role, the role of consoler, of trying to explain on a different level what happened here. But right now, the administration from NASA up through the president still trying to make sense of what happened in the skies over Texas.
It must be very frustrating for them and very difficult at this point. How specific are they typifying this for you? How specifically have they described what has happened? Can we presume that they're assuming it's the worst?
Well, that is precisely the words that were used to me. Somebody, the senior administration official said, in the event the worst happens, and it looks like it has, NASA will go first to explain to the country as best it can what it knows about what's happened.
Right. What can you tell us about the president at the time when he was informed? What was he involved with? Where was he at the time?
Well, he was at Camp David. He's a very early riser by his nature. He's usually up before 6 in the morning, so 9 is mid-morning for him. He takes a run. He was probably maybe looking over some papers, maybe just relaxing a little bit up there. Andy Card, his chief of staff, was up there. This is obviously a very important week coming ahead for the president, for the administration, for the world really, on the confrontation with Iraq. So it was a working weekend at Camp David, but he was probably in something of a down mode.
Indeed, you raised the specter for us of great complications in the next few days, because we've all been preparing for what were going to be very intense moments in what could lead to war in Iraq, with a report on Wednesday by the Secretary of State Colin Powell here in New York. Surely this must be, it couldn't have come at a worse time with regard to these other serious possible emergencies the country is facing.
Well, Bill, this is an amazing time for any presidency. The administration officials that I've spoken to over the past few months sometimes just take a step back and are amazed at how full the plate is for this president when it comes to urgent situations. Iraq, North Korea, 9/11. And now this. Almost this administration has gotten it down to, I wouldn't say a routine, but they have a very regular procedure for dealing with situations like this. Andy Card, the chief of staff, will be the nerve center with his deputy, Joe Hagan, collecting information, getting it to the president, and they have been through things like this before.
Terry Moran at the White House, thank you. He'll be keeping an eye on how the president and his staff will be handling this. The president has said NASA first, they will lead. NASA is still trying to figure out what happened. And for those of you just joining us, to bring you up to date, the Space Shuttle Columbia apparently disintegrated over Texas this morning on its way back to Earth. Video from WFAA in Dallas shows falling debris leaving multiple contrails. Residents in North Texas reported hearing a loud bang, an unusual bang at around 9 a.m. Eastern Time. That's the same time that Mission Control lost contact with the craft and issued and declared their emergency. President Bush has been informed and is on his way back to the White House from Camp David. Officials say there is no indication of terrorism at this time. Indeed, the space shuttle was more than 40 miles up when the trouble began. In 42 years of U.S. human spaceflight, there has never been an accident during the descent to Earth or during the landing. The Challenger disaster happened on takeoff, of course. Columbia was expected to land at 9:16 Eastern this morning. It was at an altitude of about 207,000 feet over north central Texas, more than 40 miles up, traveling at 12,500 miles per hour, many times the speed of sound when Mission Control lost contact. There were 6 American astronauts and 1 Israeli on board. 5 members of the crew were rookies, flying a shuttle mission for the first time. Only 2 of the 7 people on board had flown the shuttle before. We've been talking this morning to former shuttle astronaut Norm Thagard, who has a great deal of experience. He's come down many times. Mr. Thagard, assuming you're still with us, what would it be like for the pilot, who was surely somebody who had been on board before, to have such an unexperienced crew with him, only 2 of those 7 people having flown the shuttle before?
It doesn't make much difference. Everyone is so well trained that by the time you fly, whether you've flown yet or not, you've effectively flown many times in the simulator. In any event, the 3 people that are of most importance during the entry process are the commander, the pilot, and the flight engineer, and I know that almost certainly at least one of those, if not 2 of them, had prior experience.
Right. Norm Thagard, former shuttle astronaut. We now have a description by a witness, an eyewitness in Texas, Pat Gore, who describes for us what she heard and saw.
Tell us what you heard or what you felt this morning about 8 o'clock.
Well, I was in my office working, doing an income tax return, and all of a sudden my whole house shook, and I said, Gary, and I yelled at my husband, I said, Gary, my God, what's going on, and we heard this roaring noise, and it was just like a boom. We have a gas pipeline on our property, the back part of our where we live, and I thought it blew up, and we ran out the back door to look, and we looked at the sky, and that's when we saw the vapors, and it was going towards southeast, towards, I guess towards Florida, and Gary said, oh, that was probably the shuttle going through, and I said, well, oh, my God. Yeah, but the roaring sounded like a big train, and I said, well, why would we see this, and it shook me up at the house. It stayed roaring, but the window rumbled, and it's a brick home, but it scared the thunder out of me. And then I was talking to one of my drivers and saying, we just heard the thought was going through the sonic boom, coming back to in the Earth atmosphere, and that was, and he called me. One of my drivers called me back, and he said, Pat, the shuttle just blew up. And I said, get out of here,
Pat, I want.
More eyewitness descriptions of this extraordinary sound that brought people outdoors. They often hear sonic booms in that part as military jets fly overhead, but there was something completely different about the sound this morning as the shuttle apparently broke up as it came in over Texas. We're getting more details now about the 7 people on board, the crew members. There is search and rescue from NASA and other agencies out in the area now. They have told the people in the area not to touch any kind of debris that may be falling from the sky, to notify authorities immediately, but to stay away from it. Of course, the authorities will be looking for every bit of evidence they can to try to untangle the mystery of what caused this catastrophe. We know now that the crew includes Rick Husband, the shuttle commander, as a 45-year-old Air Force colonel from Amarillo, Texas. He's married with 2 children. Pilot Willie McCool is a 41-year-old U.S. Navy commander from San Diego, California. Pilot McCool is married with 3 children. This is his first shuttle flight. The payload commander, Michael Anderson, calls Spokane, Washington, his home. He's 43 years old, an Air Force lieutenant. The payload specialist Ilan Ramon is a 48-year-old Israeli Air Force colonel. He has 4 children and a wife, and this is his first flight. He is the first Israeli to fly on the shuttle. Mission specialist Kalpana Chawla is a 41-year-old pilot from Karnal, India. And 41-year-old Laurel Clark of Racine, Wisconsin is a mission specialist, a U.S. Navy commander. It's also her first flight. We're told that 5 of the 7 astronauts on board were making their first flights on the space shuttle. Terry Moran at the White House, following developments there this morning. Terry, what can you tell us?
Well, Bill, I've just been told that Vice President Cheney, by an irony, it was actually in Texas. He is hunting in Texas. He is an avid hunter and has been there, I guess, since yesterday. He was here in Washington yesterday, so he left to go to Texas. We are told he was nowhere near Dallas and did not hear anything at all, but has been briefed on the situation and is following the coverage. It is just an irony, I suppose, and a coincidence that the Vice President is in Texas when this happens in the skies over Dallas.
Right, Terry Moran at the White House. The President on his way back from Camp David, and we're expecting some kind of a statement. I take it from them later, but the President has said that NASA will go first. All eyes on NASA as they try to figure out what they can announce, what happened. They are concentrating most intensely, of course, on the search and rescue missions in the area of northern Texas. Astronaut Norm Thagard, who has flown on the shuttle, tells us it's not impossible, not terribly likely, he thinks from the pictures, but not impossible, that, for example, the cabin inside the shuttle may have remained somewhat intact. It's not impossible that one of the astronauts or some of them could have made their way out with a parachute and possibly to the ground. The search is on. There are automatic radio transmitters on the suits of the astronauts. If they did make it out and down, the search is still going on, and we don't have definitive word of exactly how NASA is going to typify this. They did announce shortly after this all happened that they would be making a statement shortly about what has happened. But so far, everybody, including those at the White House, we are told, seems to be operating under the presumption that the Space Shuttle Columbia has been lost upon re-entry this morning. After 42 years of manned spaceflight in the U.S. program, the first time that there has been a problem upon re-entry. The 1986 Challenger disaster occurred on takeoff. There were some terrible deaths, of course, on the ground, testing spacecraft before that, but never before has there been a problem upon re-entry. There is no indication whatsoever, or indeed any likelihood, we are told, that terrorism is in any way involved here. The spacecraft was more than 40 miles high, virtually in outer space when the trouble began, far out of the reach of anything that terrorists might have been involved with. We are now going to go to Jim Slade, I believe, in Washington. Is that correct? Jim, good to see you. What do you know?
Well, what we have here from the video I've seen, Sean, is a classic breakup at altitude. The spacecraft was traveling at about 12,000 miles an hour at that time. Certainly it was still under control of the computers. A human hand couldn't control it at that point. The breakup looks as though it's coming apart in piece by piece and along an arc that would continue well past the point of explosion. People thinking that it may come down in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Probably not, probably way down range from that point. There have been re-entry problems in the past. John Glenn had one with his heat shield, but there's never been a catastrophe of this kind in the American program. The Russians have lost people on re-entry, but never in the American program. However, the re-entry and landing is a terribly difficult and very complex operation. A step-by-step process that in many ways is more dangerous than liftoff. The speeds are higher, the stress on the spacecraft is worse, the heat on the spacecraft builds up to thousands of degrees. So there is any number of possibilities that could rise here to cause this kind of an accident. Right now, investigating teams are being formed at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. Those are called Tiger teams. They will be given assignments. People with expertise in the various parts of the spacecraft are coming into the Space Center at this time, and to get their assignments, some will go into the field to look at any debris that's reported. Others will begin going over the miles and miles and miles of data tape that's been accumulated on the spacecraft while it's in orbit. The spacecraft is monitored in every aspect during its flight. They can take its temperature, they can read its pulse beat. It's all recorded, it's all there to look at, and if there's some clue in the minutes leading up to this event, they'll find it.
Jim, thank you. Jim Slade, space consultant, who's been following this program for decades. We now have a report that NASA says that shuttle debris has been sighted in north central Texas. NASA has not yet come out with a formal declaration of what has happened because they've been scrambling so fast to get the search and rescue teams out there, but this is the first indication that they're saying that there's debris from the shuttle. We have an eyewitness, Gary Hunsinger, in Plano, Texas, on the phone. Now, Mr. Hunsinger, what can you tell us? What did you see and hear?
The time didn't seem extraordinary to me at all. I went out about 8 a.m. this morning because I understood there was going to be an overflight. At that point, the shuttle was already slightly east of us. A massive contrail, but everything, to my eye, looked normal. I had field glasses when I looked at the shuttle through the field glasses. I saw what I initially took to be a couple of chase jets off of each side of the shuttle, not thinking that thing was traveling thousands of miles an hour. Other than that, I've heard reports of people hearing explosions, loud roars. I heard none of that. I heard what sounded like distant jet engines, which, again, I took to be the engines of the chase jets. But not until I turned on the TV about 20 minutes later did I have any indication that there was a problem.
And just to be clear about this, Mr. Hunsinger, I take it that you now realize that what you at first thought were chase jets were apparently parts of the shuttle as it broke up. Is that right?
Obviously so.
Obviously, because it was too high and going way too fast. Right. Indeed, just to remind everybody of what we're being told by officials and all authorities, there's no indication or any likelihood that the terrorism was involved as far as they can see. It was more than 40 miles up, way out of the range of any of that kind of activity typically. This appears to be some kind of terrible accident as Columbia was making its way into its landing this morning. George Stephanopoulos is standing by in Washington. George, have you been checking with some of the other legislators in Washington? How are they being formed, and how is Washington taking all of this?
Well, as you might imagine, Bill, they're scrambling to get informed. I just spoke with Sam Brownback, the chairman of the Science and Technology Committee. He's waiting for his briefings, like so much else of official Washington right now. But he said, you know, we've all been lulled into thinking these space shuttles are just so routine, and now again we learn that they aren't. I did, however, just speak again